morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure to come today to speak with you about a topic that I think is probably near and dear to all of your hearts. And I want to thank Anna for the opportunity to come here and you for your attention. So let's talk about cognition. So what do we mean by cognition? We like to start our mornings off with a little stressor, so I'm going to start you off with a memory test. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of the kinds of tasks that you would get if you were being evaluated for Alzheimer's disease or some other cognitive ability. So what I'd like you to do is to listen to me right now, okay? Listen to the words that I'm saying and try to remember them for later. You ready? Baseball. Spain, cinnamon, slacks, Switzerland, sweater, tennis, garlic. Okay? Now repeat them to yourself. I'm going to ask you to remember those words later. Okay? Now what I want you to do, under your breath, I'm going to say a letter, and I want you to say, under your breath, as many words as you can that begin with that letter. The letter is L, ready, go. Okay, that's good. Now I'm going to say aloud a series of numbers and letters. And I want you to repeat them after me once I'm done with this string. Once I'm done saying it aloud. Okay, ready? 5, B, F, 8. Okay, say it. Okay. Now I'm going to say something similar to that, but this time I don't want you to say them back to me in the same order. This time I want you to rearrange first the letters so that they're in alphabetical order, and then the numbers so that they're in ascending order. Do you understand? Okay? Ready? 9, C, 2, J. Something like that. Yes, exactly. Okay, so what I've just given you are examples of very commonly used cognitive tests. The first example that I gave you was a test of verbal memory. So I read aloud to you, said aloud to you a series of words, and I asked you to try to retain them, right, for later. Okay? So this is the test that is most significant for Alzheimer's disease, okay? Now, your performance on that test will decrease as you age. That's a normal part of aging. And so when we think about normal cognitive aging, we think about maintaining our level of performance on that task to maximize our memory, okay? So when I say memory and when I talk about things that you can do for your memory and the research that's done, those are the kinds of tasks that they give to people when they're in clinical trials of something like vitamin E or cardiovascular exercise. They would give tasks like that at baseline, randomize people to these potential interventions that might be good for the brain, then give the tests again. Okay, so that's how these studies are done. So that's verbal memory. And it turns out that your performance on that task can predict 20 years in advance whether or not you'll get Alzheimer's disease. It's the most sensitive of the cognitive tests, okay? Now, another test that I gave you is the letter fluency test, the tell me all the words that you can think of that begin with the letter L, okay? That's a test of prefrontal function. That's a test of your fluidity, of your creativity, your ability to produce things quickly, okay? So that's a test that if you're impaired on it, we say that there's a problem with your prefrontal cortex, different area of the brain. Then I gave you a memory span test where I just read digits and letters to you, and you just said them back to me. That was fairly easy, wasn't it? Because you have this kind of RAM in your brain that allows you to maintain information in real time and then produce it back in the same order. That's pretty automatic. But the other one, when I asked you to save the numbers and digits back to me in alphabetical and then ascending order, that's a prefrontal cortex. That's working memory, okay? And working memory is the key to your ability to function well at work in particular. So when you're engaging in your day-to-day activities, your ability to take in information, manipulate it in a meaningful, goal-directed way is key to your success. Okay, so those are cognitive abilities. And now what we're going to talk a little bit about is what do we mean by cognitive aging and what do we mean by dementia, okay? So we know from large cohort studies that have followed people from the 50s to the 90s, if they survive that long, that it is perfectly normal to lose some of your cognitive capacity as you age. Very normal. That being said, there are very wide individual differences. So the way that I age cognitively will be different from the way my brother ages, from my husband, from my daughter, etc. Okay? Then there is cognitive aging that's exceeding what you'd expect by the fact that you're getting older. In other words, if your cognitive performance is less than your age peers of a similar education, that's when we get worried about there being something abnormal. Okay, so you would go into a neuropsychologist and she would give you the kinds of tests that I just gave you now. Okay, that's when we worry about abnormal cognitive aging. Okay, now we worry in particular when somebody themselves says, my memory is not as good as it used to be, and when a confederate, when somebody who lives with them, a child, a spouse, a partner, says their memory is slipping and it's exceeding what we typically expect. One gets diagnosed with dementia when the magnitude of that memory problem exceeds what you would expect for age and the person's no longer functioning well. They're not balancing their checkbook. They're not monitoring things well. They get lost when they're driving to familiar places. They repeat themselves in conversation. That's the number one thing that you will notice in your casual conversations with people who are on the verge or already have been diagnosed with dementia. They will repeat the same story in a short period of time. Okay? That's very, very common. Sometimes that happens naturally. It's not a sign. Sometimes you're really tired, so don't worry if that happened to you. It happens to me too, right? It's when it happens over and over again. In addition, when somebody has Alzheimer's disease, it's not just their memory, but some other cognitive ability. So if you give them that L test, they would only come up with 3 examples or 4 examples. You did better than that, right? You got more than 3 or 4? Okay, so you're all right. You're doing okay. Or they'd be impaired in the working memory, okay? So that's Alzheimer's disease. You have an impairment in memory, in another cognitive ability, and your functional capacity, your ability to do what you need to do on a daily basis is impaired, okay? And it's Alzheimer's disease because you've ruled out other factors, okay? But one thing that we've learned in the field of Alzheimer's disease research is that Alzheimer's doesn't occur individually very often. In other words, somebody who's diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease also has other insults to their brain, and those insults on a national level are primarily cardiovascular in nature, okay? So one's cardiovascular health is a key predictor of their brain health, okay? And the specific kinds of injuries that we're talking about are there's so much plaque that the blood flow to the brain is not optimized, or there are these tiny little strokes, tiny, tiny little ischemic damage. And when I do my neuroimaging studies in older adults, I see very healthy older adults who have this rim around the ventricles in their brain with these tiny little strokes, okay? And our goal as we age is to maintain both our cardiovascular health and our brain health. So from an economic point of view, Alzheimer's disease is very important. It's very important for us personally, right? We want to maintain our brain health so that we can have the best quality of life that we can, but from an economic point of view, it's very important as well. So the Lewin Institute did a study for the Alzheimer's Disease Association and found that the estimate cost to the United States of Alzheimer's disease between now and 2050 will be $20 trillion. $20 trillion. Okay, so why is that? The irony of getting Alzheimer's disease is that once you're diagnosed with it, you tend to live quite long, and the last few years of your life are spent in 24-hour care, right? So that's a very, very expensive proposition. So the United States, through the National Institutes of Health, is investing a lot of money in Alzheimer's disease research. It'd be great if we had a cure. We don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease. But the good news is that research suggests that we can prevent 70% of cases of Alzheimer's disease. That's even the case if somebody has the genetic risk factor for late life Alzheimer's disease, which is called apolipoprotein E4, or ApoE4. So that's good news. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we both personally and as a nation address this threat. If somebody's diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease right now in the United States, they can get a medication that enhances one of the chemicals in the brain, a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That does nothing to change the underlying disease. It treats the symptom. Okay, so there is currently no cure for Alzheimer's disease. So we have to work on prevention. And if you go into your folders today, you'll see, and Anna, thank you for printing this up, you'll see this top 10 things you can do to boost your brain. And this is from the Alzheimer's Association, which is right here in Chicago and does excellent work. Parenthetically, if any of you know somebody who has Alzheimer's disease and know a caregiver of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, I recommend that you tell that caregiver about the Alzheimer's disease website. It's very good for caregiver resources and burnout. But today what we're going to talk about are these ways that you can improve your cognitive function. Okay, so this is available online if you want to print it. Okay, now I want you to think back to that list of words that I read you. Remember the ones that I read to you, and I asked you to try to remember them for later? And I want you to try to remember them now. Anybody a little scared right now? just a wee bit scared? Who got baseball? Okay, so we remember the first things that we hear very well. What's the next thing on your list? Spain. Okay, so you did serial order in the order that I read them to you. What's the next one? Cinnamon, very good. Well-educated audience. Great. How about the next one? Slacks. Good. How about the next one? Switzerland. And the next? Sweater. And the next? Sorry? Tennis was the last one. Garlic was the second to the last. Okay, so did anybody say baseball, tennis, cinnamon, garlic, slacks, sweater? Okay, that's semantic clustering. That uses your prefrontal cortex, and that's a highly, highly effective strategy for remembering. Okay, so you cluster like things together. So when we talk about memory, what we're going to be talking about as well is the strategies that we can use to improve our memory. okay? So this morning I met Sydney. Is Sydney in here? Sydney is outside, okay? And honestly, I have a terrible memory. You ask my husband, and he just laughs at the fact that I'm a memory expert. The best moment was when I went to board a plane for Boston, picked up my backpack and said, "Excuse me, I'm going to give a lecture on memory," but I just realized by the weight of my backpack that I forgot my computer. So, memory lapses are normal. I'm not getting Alzheimer's disease. I just have a lot going on, right? As do you. So let's talk about memory in our everyday lives and what we can do to maximize this. Now, the one thing that I want to start with now is stress, okay? Now, there was a researcher who coined the term stress. His name was Hans Selye, and he said that stress can be good or bad. And in fact, there's this very, very old concept in the field of psychology called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And the idea is that the optimal amount of stress for your performance on a daily basis is an inverted U shape. So you don't want no stress, because cognitively you're not functioning at your maximum when there's no stress. You want a little bit of stress, but you don't want too much, because then your memory's impaired as well. Okay? So let's talk about the biology of this. So with stress on a daily basis, the factor that predicts whether or not it will impair your memory is its chronicity, whether it's predictable, and whether you can control it, okay? So chronic stress can be the most toxic unless your view of that chronic stress is positive, okay? So the research shows that actual stress levels don't predict brain aging. It's how you view the stressor. Okay, so you might think of Michael Jordan, and it's the fourth quarter, and he's a little bored because he's the best player by far on the team, and he would always wait, right, to those last 3-4 minutes, and then he'd just go for it, right? And he thrived on that. He played at his maximum when he had influenza, right? So he was a person who looked at stress as a challenge. And in fact, courage, when you think about courageous people, they take stress and they put a positive light on it. And the people who do that, no matter how significant the stressor, and maybe many of you find some kinds of stress, you're going to close a deal, right? And you're jonesing. It is a really positive feeling, right? If you interpret your stress like that, it turns out it's not bad for your brain. The kind of stress that's bad for your brain is the kind of stress that you interpret as negative. And we know this from the Harvard physician study, where they followed a group of Harvard physicians from the time they were practicing at Harvard to the time that they were in their 90s, if they lived that long. This is George Vaillant's study. And the factors that predicted brain aging were how they viewed the world, how they viewed stressors, and their optimism, okay? Now, how many of you commuted here today? Okay, so I had him as a guest at a neuroscience party at my house. You know, we're really dull that way. We throw neuroscience parties. But anyway, the chief stress expert in the United States is a guy named Bruce McEwen. And I asked him conceptually, Bruce, given all of your experience in the stress world, how do you view stress now? What's your definition of stress? And you know what he said? He said, Pauline, it's the commute. That's stress. So let's talk about it. It's uncontrollable, unpredictable, right? And you're kind of stuck there, right? So there are certain stressors in our life that are like that. So one of the simple tools that's evidence-based, and it's so simple, it's deceptively simple, when you're in that situation, and in fact, if you ever see me driving, you'll see me doing this a lot, because I do get worked up when I drive, is to breathe deeply, hold your breath for 20 seconds, and exhale. You breathe deeply through your nose for 20 seconds, and you exhale. So it's just, 3 of those breaths in your parasympathetic nervous system, you know, the fight or flight system, that will automatically cue your body to relax. It is the simplest way to deal with a stressor. So if you get that phone call and you gotta go talk to somebody about some really bad news, put down the phone, do those 3 breaths, and then do it. It's deceptively simple. Okay, now let's talk about chronic stress. So chronic stress is, you've got some of that positive stress in your life, some of that courageous stuff, some of the stuff that really makes you love your work, right? But then you got some other stuff that's not so stressful. Maybe you're caring for an aging parent, maybe one of your children isn't the golden child you hope they'd be. You know, maybe there's some kind of chronic stressor in your life. What do you do about that? Well, here there's also evidence-based ways to control your stress. And the best way will take you some time to learn, but once you learn it, it's highly, highly effective. And it's something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR. And this is what Phil Jackson taught the Chicago Bulls during the championship, because he was Zen before Zen was cool, okay? So MBSR. So essentially, the essence of this is that you train your brain to listen to all those negative thoughts that come up. Oh, I'm getting so angry right now. But to not evaluate them and not judge them. So the content is there without the emotional salience of that stressor. From a biological point of view, what this means is that we're in traffic and our amygdala, the animal, fiery part of our brain, starts firing because somebody's, you know, yakking, texting, you know, driving with 5 gaps between them and the person in front of them, right? And your brain is saying, I can't handle this right now, right? And you start to get that stress, you start to get that emotion, and your heart rate starts to increase. What mindfulness-based stress reduction teaches you is to say, that person's driving really poorly, but not to let the amygdala fire. So your prefrontal cortex tells your animal part of the brain not to fire. How do we know this? Because they've taken groups of very stressed individuals, high-achieving individuals, randomized them to learn mindfulness-based stress reduction in a placebo, and they scan their brains before and after, and what they find is that the prefrontal cortex, after the MBSR, puts the brake on the amygdala. Okay, so this is something that one can learn, and once you know this, it becomes a habit. And in fact, they're teaching kids in some schools to do this as a lifelong lesson. Okay, so that's a stress management technique. Other things that are good, yoga is very good for stress management. Pilates, anything else, Tai Chi, that sort of thing. The other thing that's very good for stress management is looking at that red tree right out that window. So they've actually done studies where they've randomly exposed people to nature and found that nature is very calming to people. So that's an evidence-based approach to maintaining your brain health. Okay, so stress. Now we're going to talk about social interactions. Okay, so you'll see on this list that one of the things that they recommend that you do is engage in social interactions. Why? So we have this reward system in our brain that fires the chemical dopamine. Dopamine is fired when you're eating a terrific meal, when you've got a glass of Basil Hayden that you're just loving at that moment. And it also fires when you see friends. So friends are natural rewards. And the curious thing about social media and things like Facebook and Instagram is that they've done studies and they've shown that every time a text pops up from a friend, you get a dopamine surge. And that's why our teenagers and others are addicted to this social media. It's a reward circuit. You can actually measure the functioning of this reward circuit as a function of how often people engage in this social media. So it's really important as we age to engage in social activities that are positive. If possible, you want to limit your exposure to toxic relationships, if that's possible, and you want to nurture the positive ones. And how we nurture the positive ones is also evidence-based. How many of you have had some really good news, right? So think about the last time you had some really good news and you went to share it with somebody, okay? If the response of that person that you shared it with was positive, you felt how? Elated, right? It made you even happier, right? Now, how many of you shared that information with somebody and they're like, oh, good for you? And then it just kind of went on. And that deflated your joy, right? So that's called positive empathy, okay? The way that we nurture our relationships most is through positive empathy. When you think about empathy, you usually think about, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And that's very important, but the research shows that positive empathy is even more important for relationships. You have to nurture them positively. Many of you are in positions of power. You have a lot of direct reports. And the way that we nurture those relationships is also key. There's a very long literature starting with non-human primate studies, the executive monkey, by the way, that's what it was called, the executive monkey. And it turns out that executive stress is a huge stressor as well. And you can buffer against that stress by enhancing the quality of those relationships. A 2012 Tower and Watson study showed that the best factors for predicting how well your direct reports feel in a social environment, how much they feel and therefore perform better, are if they feel like they are being heard and seen. And the second one is if you celebrate their accomplishments and help them to do work-life balance. Those are the two keys. Very large study, Tower and Watson, employee satisfaction. Okay, so those are some really important things. So social nurturing and stress. Now let's talk about exercise. It is the cure-all. Exercise is one of the best things you can do for your brain. So it turns out that in Scandinavia, they have medical records on everyone. So I have a colleague in Finland, his name's Tommy Mikkola, and I said, Tommy, can we use the population of Finland to find out if indeed Alzheimer's disease is more prevalent in women than men? And he said, sure, because he has access to all that data. And if you're a data junkie like me, it's really exciting. So why do I say this? If we want to know about what lifestyle factors predict whether you develop Alzheimer's disease later in life, you need a large study, right? And you need to follow people for how long? Let's say you want to start your intervention at age 40, and then you want to measure Alzheimer's disease later in life at 70. You've got to have a population that you follow for 30 years with really good medical records, right? So these are the Scandinavian studies. And they gave rise to a lot of information that fed into the card that you have in front of you. So what can you do? So it turns out that exercise, brisk walking, 4 times a week, 30 minutes. You don't have to run a marathon. That's good too, but you don't have to. That alone will decrease the risk of dementia by 50%. Okay, brisk walking, 4 times a week, 30 minutes. How do we know that? Because they studied this in a population and followed them from the age of 50 to the age of 80. Okay? The exercise has to be cardiovascular to get this benefit because the blood flow to the brain creates these proteins in our prefrontal cortex that help our brain to grow. Indeed, your brain, if you're listening to me, is growing a little bit. Okay, so you're growing synapses right now. Your brain is plastic. It's not static. It's constantly changing. And cardiovascular engagement is sufficient. Now, many of you have busy travel schedules, and you don't have a lot of time to exercise, and that's where this new research over the last year has come out to show that interval training is sufficient. So you can do a 20-minute workout, and as long as you do brisk walking and then 20 minutes of heightened activity so that you can say one word but not a sentence. That's how they operationally define it. If you do that for 20 seconds and then go back to the next activity for 2 minutes, then go back to that 20-second, that alone is sufficient to maintain your cardiovascular health. Very good news for busy people. Okay, so exercise. Now let's talk about diet as I look. I'm not picking on you. As I look at the carbs, right? So he very wisely eschewed the sweetened carbohydrate that was right in front of them, which, by the way, sends a dopamine signal to your brain. So, of course, we want these carbs in the morning. We want the Danish, right? So your prefrontal cortex has to say, no, don't grab the Danish. Don't do that, and has to kind of settle down your amygdala. So there is an evidence-based diet to prevent Alzheimer's disease. By evidence-based, I mean it was tested in a very large clinical trial. So they took people at baseline and they randomized them to what's known as a Mediterranean diet. You've heard of the Med diet, right? Mediterranean diet. They randomized them to that, and they randomized the other bit to nutritional training and the other half to nutritional training. And it decreased. Those who were on the Mediterranean diet were 50% less likely to develop the preclinical phase of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so what is it? It's whole grains, fruits, vegetables, red wine, hallelujah, fish, lentils, right? And very little red meat, very little dairy, lots of olive oil. That's the secret recipe. So what does that mean for today? Well, it translates at its easiest level to hummus and carrots. That's the easiest way to translate that diet on a daily basis. It's quick, it's easy, it's portable, right? So Mediterranean diet. Now, we're human. We're not going to eat Mediterranean diet all the time, right? You're not going to switch tomorrow to a Mediterranean diet and eschew everything that you like, right? So you could even dedicate one meal a day or every other day to the Med diet and still get improvement, okay? So it's not an all or none diet. The idea is that you integrate that kind of behavior, those kinds of ideas, into your diet on a regular basis, except not just the red wine one. That doesn't work. Not just the red wine one. Okay, so now let's talk about alcohol. Okay? So it's Wednesday night. You pulled a late night in the office. You commuted home. You listened to the news. You get home, and you unwind. So how do we unwind very often? Pour ourselves a glass of wine, right? Pour ourselves a cocktail. Well, turns out that a little bit of alcohol is very good for the brain. In fact, a little bit of alcohol is better than no alcohol for the brain. Might have something to do with stress. But just like that stress curve, too much is bad. And what too much is depends on whether you're male or female. Okay? So a male can have a 2-finger basal Hayden. Female can have a 1-finger basal Hayden. Okay? So women essentially have to drink half as much as men. And I say that because oftentimes in social situations, that's not taken into account, right? So alcohol, excess alcohol is highly, highly toxic to the brain for multiple reasons. One, it leads to damages in the synapses, in the way that our brain regions communicate with one another. And the other aspect of it is that it can lead to mood issues the next day. So after a night of binge drinking or excess alcohol, they've demonstrated that one's mood the next day is actually poorer. People are more irritable, they're less positive. And that's because it suppresses a brain chemical called serotonin. Okay? So alcohol has both acute effects on your brain when there's too much of it, and it has these lingering effects on the brain if one overindulges to the next day that are not good. So limiting alcohol is really important. Okay? A little bit is fine, especially if it's red wine, but limiting it is also important. Okay? Now let's also talk about one type of person who really needs to limit alcohol, and that's the person with chronic sleep problems. Okay, now, turns out that something like 60% of adults in the United States are sleep deprived. Okay? A year and a half ago, there was a publication in our premier journal, Science, that demonstrated that our brain actually has its own lymphatic system. There is a drainage system, a plumbing system around the brain. And it turns out that what that system does is it breaks down toxins that accumulate in our brain. And it does that during sleep. Okay? So your brain produces a lot of chemicals. It produces a lot of free radicals that can damage itself. But the brain has a mechanism to take care of it. It has its own plumbing system. But for that plumbing system to work, you have to sleep well. How do we know that this is important? They sleep-deprive rats. So picture this. So there are these rats in these cages, and there's some poor graduate student just saying, nope, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. Wake up. Actually, they've done studies where a mouse will fall into a pool of water, which they don't like, if they fall asleep. Okay, so that's generally how they keep them up. So it turns out that the mice who've been randomized to be sleep-deprived have more of these toxins in their brain, and they show more Alzheimer's disease pathology than the other mice. So a new area, and you'll see it on your list, in Alzheimer's disease research is making sure that people sleep well, okay? Easier said than done, right? So the easiest thing, people think, to deal with sleep problems is to take a sleep medication. That doesn't restore sleep, ironically. So the most restorative sleep is REM sleep. That's when our eyelids are twitching. If you've ever seen somebody, a child, whatever, their eyes are moving. That's the restorative type of sleep. How do we know that? Because if you wake people up during REM sleep the next day, their cognitive abilities are impaired. If you take a sleep medication, it doesn't restore REM sleep. It restores a different phase of sleep. So the sleep medications do not, in fact, recapitulate the kind of sleep that you need for adequate brain functioning. It's good in a quick pinch, good in situations of bereavement and other cases, but it's not a long-term solution. So what do we do? What do we do to enhance our sleep? How many of you have this right next to you when you sleep? Everybody, right? Everybody sleeps with their phone next to them. Okay, so the blue light, that's my kid, the blue light on this phone signals to your hindbrain here, to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, the same thing that sunshine does right out there. It says, wake up! Hello, wake up! Good morning! So when we look at our phone at night, we are telling our primitive hindbrain that it's morning. And it's counterproductive to sleep, okay? So one key thing that we need to do is to keep our cell phone usage very minimal. The other thing that research shows is that you should minimize your alcohol intake if you have sleep problems. So very, very little alcohol at night. And you're your own test subject. If you don't sleep well, and if you're, I don't know if alcohol has anything to do with it, just stop drinking for a couple nights and see how your sleep is. And you can measure it for free on your iPhone, right? Because you can measure your sleep. That's one thing. Your brain likes schedules. So you have these diurnal clocks. Your body has a core temperature rhythm that it engages in every day. And in fact, every cell of your body has its internal diurnal rhythm. And that's why somebody just won the Nobel Prize, okay? Because they discovered that each cell has this. So if you can ingrain in that kind of cycle an expected sleep onset time and try to go to bed at about the same time every night and try to wake up at that same time, that is the single best thing you can do to improve your sleep. And maybe for you it's 1 in the morning, right? But just make it predictable and limit distractions. Okay, so sleep is very, very important. And then let's talk about other things that you can do to enhance your brain, which is one of the things that you might be doing right now, which is listening to me. So this is a very well-educated group. And the good news is that people who have a lot of education are more resilient to Alzheimer's disease than other people. Okay, so picture a neuron like a tree out there. So your neurons have these branches, and they have these leaves. Those leaves are called dendritic spines. And those make functional connections to the next tree. They touch that, and that's what the communication is. If you're a highly educated person, your dendrites are bushier. You have more leaves on your tree. So you can lose more as you age than other people and still maintain your cognitive functioning. Does that make sense? Okay? So education is very good. Now, you've been hearing a lot about these online tools to improve your cognitive functioning, right? Luminosity, right? They're not evidence-based. There's no evidence that those benefit your brain. And in fact, sorry if you invested in it. Well, maybe not, because you're probably making a lot of money on it. But at any rate, luminosity, though, the principle of it is right. So it is, in fact, the case that use it or lose it works with your brain. So how do you use it? Many of you have expertise in something that others recognize in you. You have a cognitive skill that others recognize that you do. It's your expertise, okay? That, unfortunately, it will stay with you when you age. That's one of the cognitive abilities that doesn't slip as you age. Expertise, in fact, it grows. That's good news, right? Contributes to your success and your well-being. But the other kinds of activities, cognitive activities that you need to engage in are challenging cognitive activities, like learning another language, something that's difficult. I'm trying to memorize Hamilton. That's just my thing, okay? So it is really hard. It's just incredibly hard. So you have to exercise your brain. It has to be an effortful thing. It can be something like, and there was a randomized trial of couples that engaged in dancing. That was terrific because they had to remember their steps, they were getting physical activity, and they were getting social activity. It was a great mixture of three things that benefit the brain. Okay, so that kind of thing. Bridge is another one. Paddleball is all the rage in my village right now. So paddleball is a good one, right? Anything that's new for you. Okay? What's not good for your brain? TV watching. They've actually studied this, and TV makes us stupid. It's true. They've studied this in randomized trials. And it turns out that as we age, we tend to watch more TV. So that's something that we should avoid. Okay, so we're going to decrease our television watching. That's the last one. Now let's talk about mental health. Okay? Any insult to the brain, you've heard about the football players developing dementia, right? So we know that concussions lead to changes in brain structure that make the brain more vulnerable as people age. It actually, concussions shear axons. They tear apart the trunk of the tree. Okay, that's what concussions do. And you don't even have to lose consciousness. A series of concussions alone is a risk factor for dementia, particularly if you're genetically susceptible to dementia. Okay, so sports that lead to concussions are to be avoided. Okay, so that's one brain health feature. Avoid traumatic brain injury. And if you've had them, work all the harder to buffer the brain using those other techniques that I just described. But the other aspect is mental health. So 20% of us during our lifetime will develop a major depressive disorder. 15% of us will develop a generalized anxiety disorder. That's just the facts. That's just what happens. And it turns out that depression and anxiety disorders are risk factors for dementia. We've heard about antidepressants. They work on a brain chemical called serotonin. selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, Zoloft, and they work. Mechanically, they work very well. If you were to come into our lab, I could experimentally, just for fun, deplete your brain of serotonin. I could do that by giving it reversibly. It will only last for a couple hours. You don't come in and then I send you home depressed. It turns out that if I depleted your brain of serotonin, you would only get depressed if you personally or somebody in your main family, your nuclear family, has a history of major depressive disorder. But all of you would have a difficult time paying attention. All of you. So serotonin is key for our brain functioning. And depression is an example of a clinical condition where, in fact, you experience cognitive inattentiveness and memory problems. In addition, during this state called depression, there's excess of this chemical called cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is the thing that was surging through your body when you were watching the Cubs last year, and probably even this year. It's that thing that got you going, got your heart racing, okay? So cortisol is a stress hormone, and a little bit of cortisol is good, too much is bad. People who are depressed have chronically high levels of cortisol. Consequently, the memory regions of their brain are smaller. So you can actually see this. You see the same thing in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. So our neuroimaging studies with soldiers demonstrate that their memory systems in the brain are much smaller, anatomically smaller than other people. So for depression, usually the best treatment is cognitive behavior therapy by a trained therapist. And the way that it works is that it engages, and we know this from imaging studies, your prefrontal cortex to tell repeated thoughts to go away. And the prefrontal cortex gets more active following cognitive behavior therapy. The good thing about it is it works your whole life. Unlike an antidepressant, which no longer works after you're done taking it, okay? So we want to absolutely be sure to maintain our cognitive health. The other thing that we want to do as we age is to limit distraction. How many times do you think we check our cell phone every day, on average? $75, 20? 20,000, that's closer to it. We check this on average once every 5 minutes. Once every 5 minutes is how frequently people in the United States check their cell phone. If you've traveled to Europe lately, it's a US thing. It's fascinating. I was just in Scotland. Nobody had their cell phone out. They were all talking to each other. So nobody's going to dement in Scotland. Well, there's Glenmorangie. Anyway, so they're looking at their cell phone, right? They're looking at their cell phone. So it turns out that you cannot multitask. You cannot both talk on your speakerphone and text somebody, or talk on your speakerphone and read an email. You're not doing either task. We know this for a fact. There is no point in multitasking. The idea of multitasking, it's a neurobiological absurdity. You can't do it. Multitasking does not exist. So the key to maintaining good attention in your day-to-day basis is to try not to get distracted by this. They've actually shown that people take 30 minutes to go back to optimal performance after checking their cell phone. Okay? So avoid this as a distraction. And then finally, just the last one, what you want to do is you want to take micro breaks during your work. So we know the precise formula for optimal performance. It's 57 minutes of aggressive work followed by 12 minutes of a break. That leads to 25% higher productivity than no break alone. Micro breaks work. You can make it 45-15 if you want. Okay, so we've gone through these aspects for maintaining your brain health as you age. I would recommend that, oh yeah, and if you smoke, quit. Yeah, if you do that, So you can consult this. There's excellent information at the Alzheimer's Association, and I thank you for your attention.